The auction notice had been nailed to the post outside Harlan's General Store for 3 weeks before the morning of October 4th, 1882, and in all that time, not a single soul in Dusty Creek, New Mexico Territory, had expressed the faintest interest in bidding on the Talbot orchard, not because the land itself was worthless, but because everyone in town believed the woman still living on it was too stubborn to ever leave quietly. Jennie Talbot had known the auction was coming. She had known it the way a person knows a storm is gathering before the clouds have even rolled in off the mesa. She could feel it in her chest, low and tight, the way grief and dread press together until they become something almost indistinguishable from each other. She had read the notice herself on a Tuesday morning, her fingers flour-dusted from the biscuits she had been making before she walked to town for the second time that week, and she had stood in front of it long enough that old Harlan Prout came out from behind his counter and offered her a glass of water, which she declined with a politeness that had taken everything she had. The notice stated plainly that the property commonly known as the Talbot Orchard, 43 acres of apple and peach trees on the eastern slope of the Red Clay Hills outside Dusty Creek, was to be sold at public auction on October 4th, 1882, at 10 o'clock in the morning, to settle the outstanding debt of the late Cornelius Talbot, formerly of the territory of New Mexico. Jennie's father had been dead for 4 months. The bank had waited precisely 4 months and 2 weeks before making its move, which Jennie thought was either the bare minimum of human decency or the maximum of it, depending on how charitable a person was feeling. She was not feeling particularly charitable. What the notice did not mention, because notices never mention things like this, was that Jennie had been tending those trees for as long as she could hold a pruning saw. She had planted 6 of the newer peach rows herself, at 14 years old, following her father's direction. She had nursed the oldest apple trees through a blight in 1877 that had killed nearly every orchard for 30 miles in either direction. She had hauled water up the eastern slope by herself through 2 summer droughts, one in 1879 and one just this past July, using a yoke her father had fashioned from a bent mesquite branch and 2 old tallow barrels. She was 24 years old, and the orchard was as much a part of her as her own hands, possibly more, since her hands had developed their calluses in service of it. The orchard was ruined, technically speaking. That was the word people in Dusty Creek used when they talked about it, which they did, because small towns in the New Mexico Territory in 1882 did not have a great deal of entertainment, and a woman fighting a losing battle against debt and drought and bad luck was at least something to discuss over supper. The blight had returned the previous autumn, less severe than before but still devastating. Several of the oldest apple trees, the ones her grandfather had planted before the war, had begun to show signs of root rot from a season of unusual flooding, followed immediately by the worst dry spell anyone could remember. The peach crop this year had been poor, not catastrophically poor, but poor enough that, when added to the existing debt her father had accumulated through 2 bad years, and a medical account with Dr. Sims that had grown steadily from 1880 until Cornelius Talbot's final morning, the sum total was simply more than Jennie could manage alone. She had tried. That was the thing no one quite understood, or perhaps the thing they understood perfectly but could not figure out how to say without it sounding like pity. She had gone to the bank in March, 6 weeks after her father's death, with the ledger she kept herself, a neat, careful account of what the orchard produced and what it owed, and what she believed it would produce if given one more season and some investment in lime treatment for the soil. Marcus Webb, who managed the Dusty Creek branch of the Territorial Savings and Loan, had listened to her with the expression of a man attending a church service he did not particularly believe in. He had been polite. He had offered her coffee. He had told her that the debt was simply too large, that the bank's board had made its decision, and that the auction would proceed in October. She had thanked him, walked out of the bank, crossed the street to the dry goods store, purchased a bar of lye soap and 2 yards of cotton muslin, and walked the 4 miles home to the orchard without speaking to another person. When she arrived, she had gone directly to the oldest row of apple trees and stood among them for a long time, one hand against the rough bark of the largest one, feeling the solid, indifferent fact of it against her palm. Then she had gone inside, washed her face, and started supper. That was Jennie Talbot. She grieved the way certain trees weathered drought deeply, quietly, without drama, drawing what she needed from whatever reserves remained and simply continuing to stand. In the weeks between reading the notice and the morning of the auction, she had done what she always did. She had gotten up before dawn. She had tended her trees. She had mucked out the small stable where she kept her horse, a 15-year-old roan mare named Cora, who was more companion than working animal at this point. She had mended fences, turned compost, treated the affected trees with a lime wash she had mixed herself according to a method she had read about in an agricultural gazette her father had subscribed to for 30 years. She had preserved what peaches she could, filled the cellar with jars of pale amber fruit in syrup. She had made herself useful to herself and to the land, because that was the only thing she knew how to do with despair. She was doing precisely this, standing on the lower branches of a crooked peach tree at the edge of the south orchard, checking the new growth on a grafted branch that she had attached to the trunk 2 years prior, and which had, against considerable odds, taken hold and begun to thrive, when she heard the sound of a horse approaching on the road below. She had, of course, known that someone would come. She had heard the gavel strike the auctioneer's block from the orchard. Sound carried well out here in the open country, especially in October when the air was thin and clear as glass. She had heard voices, not many, which had been predictable enough, and she had kept working, because she had decided somewhere between dawn and mid-morning that she would keep working until the moment someone physically told her to stop. Not out of defiance exactly, or not only out of defiance. More because work was the truest language she knew, and the trees did not care who owned them on paper. They needed her today the same way they had needed her yesterday. The hoofbeats slowed, stopped. She heard the creak of leather as someone dismounted. She did not look down immediately. She finished checking the graft, ran her thumb along the joint where the new wood met the old, felt the small satisfaction of finding it solid and well bonded. Then she descended, stepping carefully from branch to branch, the skirt of her work dress tucked into her belt in the practical way her father had never particularly approved of, but had long since stopped objecting to. When she reached the ground and turned around, she found a man standing at the edge of the orchard row, holding the reins of a solid bay gelding in one hand and holding his hat in the other, as if he had taken it off upon approaching. He was tall, not unreasonably so, but the kind of tall that a person noticed, that made him seem slightly larger than the space he occupied. He had dark hair that needed cutting, sun-darkened skin, and the look of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. He wore a coat that had once been good quality and still was, simply worn with regular use rather than neglect. He was perhaps 30, give or take a year. He did not look like a banker. He did not look like any of the men she had expected. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not immediately read, not surprised exactly, though she supposed she must have been an unexpected sight, coming down out of a tree with her skirts tucked up and her boots covered in bark dust. Not unkind. More like a man who had arrived expecting one thing and found another and was giving himself a moment to take in the reality of it. "Miss Talbot," he said. "That's right," she said, and she untucked her skirt and shook it straight. "And you would be the new owner, I suppose." "August Townsend," he said. He shifted the hat in his hand, seemed briefly uncertain whether to extend his hand for a shake, and then did, which she appreciated more than she expected to. She shook it. His grip was firm but not performatively so. "I expect you already know why I'm here." "I expect I do," she said. "You'll want to look over what you've bought." "I would," he said, "if that's agreeable." She studied him for a moment. He met her gaze steadily, but without the aggressive quality that men sometimes adopted when they wanted to establish dominance quickly. He seemed simply patient, as if he had all the time in the afternoon and intended to use it respectfully. "Come on then," she said, and she turned and began walking up the row. He tied his gelding to the fence post and followed. She had expected him to ask questions about the debt or the structure of the property or what she intended to do now. Those were the practical questions, the ones that needed answering. Instead, as she walked him through the south orchard and then the main apple block, he mostly looked at the trees. He looked at them carefully, the way a person looks at something they are genuinely trying to understand rather than simply assess for value. He crouched at one point to examine the base of an older apple tree she had flagged with a strip of red cloth, one of the ones showing root rot, and he pressed 2 fingers into the soil around it and looked at the moisture and the color. "You've been treating this," he said. It was not a question. "Lime wash," she said, "and I've been working in composted oak bark around the root zone. It's not a cure, but it slows the progression." He nodded slowly. "Where did you learn that method?" "Gazette," she said. "And some of it I worked out myself over time." She paused. "My father kept good records. I've continued them." He stood and looked at her again with that same considering expression. "How long have you been running this orchard?" "I've been working it my whole life," she said. "Running it on my own since my father took ill in 1880, so about 2 years. And the grafting work," he nodded toward the row of peach trees behind them where the graft she had been checking was visible. "Mine," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm going to be honest with you, Miss Talbot, because I think you've earned the directness." She waited. "I know nothing about orchards," he said. "I grew up working cattle in Texas. I've spent the last 6 years buying and selling land, some of it successfully, some of it not. I saw the auction notice when I was passing through on my way north, and I bid on this property because something about it struck me as worth saving. I cannot tell you exactly why. Something about the slope and the soil and the fact that those trees are still standing despite everything." He looked up at the rows of trees. Their leaves turned copper and gold in the October light. "But I know I am not the right person to do what needs doing here." "You are." Jennie said nothing for a moment. She was looking at the trees too, though she had looked at them 1,000 times and knew every branch. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Townsend?" "I'm not sure yet," he said honestly. "I wanted to see it first, talk to you first." He looked back at her. "Are you planning to leave?" The question was so direct it almost knocked the breath out of her. She had been asked many things in the past 4 months, whether she was managing, whether she needed help, whether she had family elsewhere she might go to, whether she had considered what she would do next, but no one had asked her this so plainly, as if her answer genuinely mattered and was not already assumed. "No," she said. "I have nowhere else I want to be, and these trees need tending through winter or the root rot will take 3 more of them before spring." He nodded. "Then stay," he said. She looked at him sharply. "On what terms?" "Fair ones," he said. "I want to think about it properly before I name specifics, but I'm not here to put you out, Miss Talbot. I wouldn't have bid if I intended to let it go to ruin." She believed him. She did not entirely understand why she believed him, since she had known him for approximately 40 minutes and he was standing on land that was legally his while she had nothing on paper to her name. But she believed him, and Jennie Talbot had learned over 24 years to trust her own judgment about people, because it was usually correct, and because there was rarely much else to rely on out here. "All right," she said. "I'll stay until you've worked out your terms. But I'll tell you now, I'm not a woman who accepts charity dressed up as something else, and I'm not a woman who can be pushed around on her own land." "I understand that," he said, and something in his expression shifted, not quite a smile, but the precursor to one, a kind of recognition. "For what it's worth, I don't have any interest in pushing anyone around, and I don't believe in charity that isn't called what it is." She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "You can put your horse in the small paddock behind the stable," she said. "I'll make coffee." It was a strange beginning. Neither of them would have claimed otherwise. August Townsend set up his bedroll in the small tack room at the back of the stable, which had a wood-burning stove and a reasonable roof, and was perfectly adequate as temporary lodging. And Jennie continued sleeping in the house where she had been born, and where her parents had lived, and where she had sat beside her father's bed in his last weeks. The house was not large, 2 rooms downstairs, 1 room up, a covered porch along the front, but it was solid, built from adobe brick with a wooden frame, and it kept the cold out reasonably well. August came to the house for meals, which Jennie cooked with the practical efficiency of someone who had been cooking for another person long enough that it was simply habit. She had cooked for her father, and before that her father had cooked for both of them, and before that her mother had cooked for all 3. But her mother had been gone since Jennie was 7, taken by a fever that came and went in 3 days, and left behind a silence that Cornelius Talbot had never entirely filled, and never entirely stopped trying to fill. The first morning, August came to the door at 5:30, just as Jennie was finishing the biscuits, and he stopped in the doorway and said, "I'd like to help today if you'll direct me." She looked at him across the kitchen. "Have you ever pruned an apple tree?" "No," he said. "Trimmed any kind of fruit tree?" "No." "Treated a blight?" "No." "What can you do?" she asked, not unkindly but practically. He thought about it for a moment. "I can dig," he said. "I can haul. I can follow direction. I'm strong and I'm not afraid of hard work. I can learn fast if someone's willing to teach." She considered him for a moment, then set a plate of biscuits on the table. "Sit down," she said. "We'll plan the morning over breakfast." And so began a routine that neither of them had designed, but which organized itself as routines do in places where there is always more work than time. August did the heavy hauling, the compost, the water barrels when the eastern trough ran low, the posts that needed resetting along the upper fence line. He dug out the roots of a dead apple tree in the northwest corner that Jennie had been putting off because the tap root went deep and the work was brutal, and he spent 2 full days at it with a mattock and a determination that she found herself watching from a distance when she thought he would not notice. He did not complain. He did not make a production of the difficulty. He simply worked, and she taught him. She had not expected to enjoy this. She had expected it to feel like burden added to burden. But she discovered that August was the kind of person who listened with his whole attention, who asked questions that were genuinely intelligent and not merely conversational, and who absorbed what he was told and then applied it carefully. Within a week, he could identify 3 varieties of apple tree by their bark alone. Within 2 weeks, he could tell the difference between the early signs of blight and the normal autumn dieback. That was simply part of the cycle. He had what Jennie privately recognized as a farmer's eye, not knowledge yet, but the capacity for it, the habit of looking at the natural world as something to be understood rather than simply used. In the evenings after supper, they sat at the kitchen table and went over the ledger. This had been August's suggestion, made carefully on the 3rd evening when he had said, "I'd like to understand the full picture of what the orchard owes and what it can produce. Would you be willing to walk me through the records?" She had expected this to feel like an invasion, her careful ledger scrutinized by someone who now technically had a claim to everything it documented. Instead, it felt oddly like being seen. He looked at her entries with the same careful attention he gave the trees, and after a long while he said, "You've been subsidizing this operation with your own labor at a rate that isn't recorded anywhere." "It doesn't need to be recorded," she said. "It's just what I do." "It should be recorded," he said quietly. "It's the most significant contribution to this property's survival." She did not know what to say to that. She was accustomed to her own work being the invisible foundation of things, the labor that everyone benefited from and no one counted. She looked down at the ledger and then back up at him, and she found that he was looking at her with that steady, level quality she had come to recognize as simply how he paid attention to things. "The debt to the bank is settled," he said. "That's done. The medical debt to Dr. Sims," he looked at the page, "how much of that remains?" $42, she said. "I'll settle it this week." "Mr. Townsend, it's a business expense," he said firmly but not harshly. The orchard cannot move forward with that hanging over it. It will be recorded in the ledger as an orchard expense, and when the property begins generating real income, it can be repaid to me from the proceeds. That's not charity, Miss Talbot, that's a business arrangement. She studied him for a long moment. You are very determined to be fair, she said. I try to be, he said simply. I've seen what unfairness does to people and places, and I don't have any interest in adding to it. She wanted to ask what he meant by that, what he had seen, but she let it go for the evening. There would be time. Somehow, sitting at this table with the lamp burning low between them and the ledger open, and the sound of the wind finding its way around the corners of the house, she felt certain there would be time. In the mornings they worked. In the evenings they talked. Not always about the orchard eventually, as the days accumulated. They talked about other things too. August told her about growing up in the hill country of Texas, his father's cattle operation, the long drives north as a young man, the years afterward when he had drifted toward land dealing because it seemed to offer a stability that the cattle business never quite managed. He had bought and sold 7 properties over 6 years, he said, some good, some not. He had made mistakes. He had learned from them. He said all of this without drama, simply as fact. She told him about the orchard in winter, how it looked when the trees were bare, and the frost came down off the high country to the north, a blue-white stillness that she found beautiful in a way that was inseparable from sadness. She told him about the year the creek flooded, and her father waded thigh-deep into the orchard to clear debris from around the tree roots, laughing the entire time because there was nothing else you could do when the land was determined to test you. She told him about the blight of 1877, how she had been 16 and how she had worked beside her father for 3 weeks solid, stripping infected wood, burning it downhill, treating every remaining tree by hand. We saved 22 trees that year, she said, out of 38 affected. You saved 22 trees, he said. She looked at him. Your father had already taken ill by then, he said quietly. He had been listening carefully enough to the things she said and the things she did not say to understand the order of things. She was quiet for a moment. He helped as much as he could, she said. He was always trying to help as much as he could. I know, August said. I can see it in the way you talk about him. She looked down at her coffee cup. The lamp light moved softly across the table between them. Outside, the October wind moved through the orchard and the trees shifted in it, bare-branched and quiet and patient as old things always are. He would have liked the graft on the South Peach tree, she said. He was always very interested in grafting. He said it was the most hopeful thing in agriculture, the idea that you could take the best of one thing and join it to something struggling, and they would grow together into something neither of them could have managed alone. She had not meant it as anything more than a memory, but she heard it in the air of the room after she said it, and she thought August did too, because there was a particular quality to the silence that followed. He sounds like a wise man, August said eventually. He was, she said. He had a lot of foolish moments too, but yes, mostly wise. November came and the nights got cold enough that she could see her breath at dawn and the frost lay heavy on the low ground. The work shifted accordingly, less in the active sections of the orchard, more in the preparations for winter, the mulching, the wrapping of younger trees against the cold, the careful attention to drainage that would determine whether the following spring saw new growth or rot. August worked in gloves now, and Jennie wore her heavy canvas coat, and Cora the old mare stood in her stall and regarded them both with the mild, philosophical patience of an animal who had seen many winters and expected to see more. One morning in mid-November, Jennie came out to the stable to find August crouched beside one of the rear stall boards, fitting a new plank where the old one had rotted through. He had noticed it the day before and gone to Harlan's that afternoon for lumber, and now he was doing it at dawn before she had even finished making coffee. He looked up when he heard her. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know, he said. But it needed doing and I was up early. She leaned against the stall doorframe and watched him for a moment. Cora turned her head and pressed her nose against Jennie's shoulder in greeting. "Can I ask you something?" Jennie said. "Anything," he said, still fitting the plank. "Why here?" she said. "You said you were passing through when you saw the notice. Where were you heading?" He was quiet for a moment, fitting the board and testing it. Then he said, "I don't know, honestly. North," I said to myself. "Colorado, maybe." I had heard about some land opportunities up around the San Juan Basin. He paused. "But I've been thinking about it since I arrived, and I think the truth is I wasn't heading anywhere in particular. I had been moving for 6 years, and I had stopped knowing why I was moving, and I hadn't admitted it to myself yet." She stroked Cora's nose gently. "And the orchard changed that." He looked up at her then, and his expression was more open than usual, more unguarded. "I think you changed that," he said. "The orchard had something to do with it, but I think it was you." She felt the words settle into her chest. She did not deflect them or dismiss them. She looked at him steadily for a moment, the way she looked at a new growth on a grafted branch, with care, with honesty, with the patience to understand what was actually there rather than what she hoped was there. "You've only known me 6 weeks," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not saying it's arrived anywhere yet. I'm just saying what I think is true." She nodded slowly. She pushed off from the doorframe. "Coffee's ready," she said. "Come in when you're done." She walked back to the house. She stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the orchard, the bare silver-gray branches against the pale morning sky, and she allowed herself to feel what she felt without naming it yet, because some things needed time the same way grafts needed time, and the worst thing you could do was pull at them before they were ready. The first snow came in late November, light and dry, the kind that dusted the tops of the branches and made the orchard look like something from a picture book. August had never seen an orchard in snow before, and he stood at the edge of the south block for a long time, looking up at the rows, and Jennie stood beside him because she had loved this sight for as long as she could remember, and she found herself wanting to share it. "It's beautiful," he said. "Yes," she said. "Even now, especially now, maybe." He turned to look at her. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the trees, the way the snow sat in the joints of the branches, the particular gray-blue light that came with snow sky. She had snow on the brim of her hat and a high color in her cheeks from the cold, and she looked entirely at home in a way that he found he could not stop finding remarkable. This woman who belonged to this place so completely that even the elements seemed to settle around her as if she were part of the landscape. "Jennie," he said. He had started using her given name about 2 weeks earlier, tentatively at first, and she had not objected, which he had taken as the small, significant signal it was. She turned to look at him. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I'd like to propose the terms, formally. I've been thinking about them since I arrived, and I think they're right." She waited. 50-50, he said. "Equal partnership. You contribute the knowledge, the work, the history. I contribute the capital to get the orchard through the next 2 growing seasons while it recovers. All income split equally, all decisions made together, and the deed, I want to put your name on it." She stared at him. "That's not a business arrangement," she said. She stopped. "It's what's fair," he said. "You said you weren't a woman who could accept charity dressed up as something else." "This isn't charity. This is an acknowledgement of value. Your labor and your knowledge are worth exactly as much as my capital. The deed should reflect that." She looked away again, out at the orchard. She felt something warm and complicated moving through her chest, something that had been building for weeks and that she had been keeping carefully in its place, the way you keep a lamp turned low when you do not yet know how much oil remains. "I want to think about it," she said. "Of course," he said. "Give me until tomorrow. Take all the time you need." She thought about it through the afternoon and into the evening, working in the kitchen while the snow came down outside and the lamp on the table cast its amber circle. She thought about what it would mean, not just practically, but in every dimension. She had been alone with this land for 4 months since her father's death, and alone in the practical running of it for nearly 3 years before that. And there was a part of her that had grown so accustomed to the weight of solitude that she was not entirely sure she knew how to set it down. But she also knew, with the clarity that honest reckoning always brings, that she could not save the orchard alone. She had known this since March, since Marcus Webb's polite expression in the bank. The trees needed more than she could give them by herself, at least in the short term, and turning down a fair arrangement out of pride was not the same thing as being independent. Her father had told her that once in a different context, and she had been young enough to argue with him about it. She was not that young anymore. She thought too about August Townsend, about the 6 weeks she had known him, and she tried to examine what she knew about him the way she examined the soil around a tree's roots, practically, honestly, without wishful thinking. He worked hard. He was fair. He listened. He had not tried to impose himself on anything, not on the orchard's management, not on her space, not on her grief. He had offered and waited and offered and waited, and he had been consistent in a way that she found herself depending on without having planned to. And there was the other thing, the thing she was less comfortable examining, which was simply that she liked him. She liked talking to him at the kitchen table. She liked the sound of his voice in the mornings when he came to the door. She liked the way he looked at things carefully, genuinely, as if the world was worth understanding. She liked that he had told her the truth about not knowing where he was going, which had cost him something in terms of the image a man generally tries to maintain, and he had offered it anyway. She did not go so far that night as to call what she felt love. But she recognized the country, the way you recognize the outline of mountains you have only ever seen in photographs. Yes, this is the place. You are somewhere close. In the morning she went to the stable before he was up. She knocked on the tack room door and his voice came alert, which told her he was a light sleeper, a quality she associated with people who had spent years in open country. "Come in," he said. She opened the door. He was sitting on his bedroll, already dressed, his dark hair standing up slightly from sleep. He looked in that unguarded early morning moment, younger than he usually did and less composed, and she felt the warmth move through her again. "Yes," she said. "To the terms, but I want to add one." He nodded, reaching for his boots. "We do this as genuine equals," she said. "Not just on paper. Any decision that affects the orchard we make together. If we disagree, we talk it through until we reach something we both believe in. I won't be overridden and I won't be managed." "Agreed," he said immediately. "And the deed goes in both names from the beginning. I'll go to Dusty Creek this week and speak to the land office." "Good," she said. She paused in the doorway for a moment. The morning light was coming in through the small stable window, and it caught the dust in the air, and the sound of Cora shifting in her stall was the only sound except the distant wind in the trees. "August," she said. He looked up from lacing his boot. "Thank you," she said, "for bidding. I know it was a ruin by anyone else's measurement. Thank you for seeing it as something else." He held her gaze for a moment with that steady, patient expression. "I'd have bid 10 times what I bid," he said, "if that had been required." She left him to finish dressing and went back to the house to make the biscuits, and she hummed something soft and wordless to herself as she did, which she had not done since before her father died. The land office visit, which August made on a Thursday in early December, did not go entirely smoothly. The clerk at the office, a thin young man named Blevins who wore his hair parted with mathematical precision, was clearly uncertain what to do with the request to register the deed jointly in the names of August Townsend and Jennie Talbot, without the two of them being husband and wife. He consulted his records. He consulted a second set of records. He asked August twice whether he was sure about the arrangement. "Perfectly sure," August said both times, with a patience that he maintained by thinking about Jennie's expression when she said thank you in the stable doorway that morning. Blevins ultimately produced the paperwork, and August signed it, and then he rode back to collect Jennie from the orchard, and they rode together back to town so she could sign too. When she pressed her pen to the paper and wrote her name, Jennie R. Talbot, in her careful, upright script, the clerk looked slightly distressed, as if he was witnessing something that conflicted with his understanding of how property was meant to work. Jennie did not notice his expression, or if she did, she chose not to address it. She set the pen down and looked at August, and her eyes were bright with something. She kept composed, but only just. "There," she said quietly. "There," he agreed. They rode home side by side through the December afternoon, and the conversation moved easily between them. About the lime treatment schedule for spring, about the fence posts that needed replacing along the northern boundary, about a method of dealing with the root rot that August had read about in a journal he had found at Harlan's, and that Jennie looked at and said, "Yes, that's close to what I've been trying. We should combine approaches." She had said without thinking about it. August did not comment on it, but she felt him notice it, the same way she had begun to feel him notice things, the small, particular attentiveness of a person who is watching someone with real care. That evening after supper, when they sat at the table with the ledger and the plans for the coming year, August poured coffee for both of them and then said, without preamble, "I would like to court you properly, if that's agreeable." She set down her coffee cup. She looked at him across the table, the lamp between them casting its familiar amber light. She had known this was coming, not in any specific form, but in the general sense that something was building between them that had a clear direction, the way you can see the weather turning in the character of the clouds. "You want to court me," she said. "Yes," he said. "I want to do it right. I don't want to presume anything. I know you're a woman who values her independence, and I am not asking you to give that up. I'm asking if you're willing to see if this is what I believe it might be." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved through the bare orchard. Cora shifted in her stall. The lamp flame leaned slightly and recovered. "I have some conditions," she said. "I would expect nothing less," he said. "I won't be rushed," she said. "I've been managing my own life for a long time, and I will not be hurried into anything. Understood? And if we find at any point that it's not working, that we are better as partners in the orchard than in anything else, I need to know that the orchard arrangement stands regardless, that my name stays on that deed no matter what else happens between us." He looked at her steadily. "Jennie," he said, and his voice was quiet and firm, "your name is on that deed because it is right and fair and because it belongs there. That has nothing to do with anything else. It won't change." She believed him. She had believed him, she thought, from the first afternoon when he had come to her in the orchard and looked at the trees the way you look at something worth saving. "Then yes," she said, "we can see." He smiled then, a real smile, the full one which she had not yet seen at full capacity and which changed his face in a way that she felt in her chest like a struck chord. He had a good smile. She had suspected it. She had been right. "Good," he said. And then he opened the ledger and said, "Now the north fence line. We were discussing the posts." She laughed, a genuine laugh, surprised out of her, and he looked pleased, and they went back to the ledger. Courting in the New Mexico territory in the winter of 1882 was necessarily a practical affair. There were no theaters, no promenades, no opportunities for the elaborate social rituals of courtship that books described. What there was work in proximity, and the small daily choices about how you treated a person, and August turned out to be good at all of these in ways that Jennie had not anticipated. He brought her small things, not expensive or impractical, but thoughtful. A book about orchard management that he had ordered from Santa Fe, which arrived in December, and which she opened with the reverence most people reserved for things considerably more sacred. A twist of cinnamon candy from Harlan's on a particularly cold Friday when he had ridden to town for supplies, set on the kitchen table with no comment. A sketch he had made of the orchard from the ridge to the east, the first good winter morning sketch she had ever seen of it, which he left on the porch one morning, and which she put inside the cover of the ledger and kept there. He asked her about her mother. He was the first person in years to ask, and she told him about the fever, about being 7 years old, about the way her father had moved through the years afterward with the careful, sustained sadness of a man who had loved one person most and lost them early. August listened without trying to fix anything or say the things that people said. He simply listened, and she found that this was the thing she had not known she needed most, to have the stories she carried heard by someone who was genuinely interested in holding them. In turn, she asked about his family, and learned that his mother was still living in Texas, that she was a sharp and capable woman who had managed the cattle operations books for 40 years, and who August described with a combination of affection and slight wariness that Jennie recognized as the hallmark of a person raised by someone they genuinely respected. His father had died 3 years ago, a quick death, a heart that stopped in the middle of an ordinary morning, and August carried this with the quiet steadiness she had come to associate with him. But she could see it was a real loss, and she did not minimize it. Christmas came, and Jennie made a supper that was far more elaborate than practical, a roast chicken and preserved peach pie and cornbread with the last of the good butter. And August appeared at the house door with two things: a small bottle of good whiskey, which he set on the table, and a sprig of dried apple blossom he had found pressed in one of the old ledgers when he was organizing the storage room, which he handed her without explanation. She held the dried blossoms carefully. They were from years ago. She recognized her father's handwriting on the little slip of paper tucked inside the paper they had been folded in. Spring 1871. She had been 13 that year. "I thought you should have it," August said simply. She pressed her lips together for a moment and then looked up at him with steady eyes. "Thank you," she said. "Sit down. The chicken will be ready in 10 minutes. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and sat, and the warm domesticity of it filled the small kitchen like something she had not known she was hungry for. In January, the cold deepened and the work in the orchard slowed, and they used the time to plan the spring season in detail. Which sections needed the most intensive treatment, what new planting they wanted to attempt, whether there were varieties worth adding to supplement the existing trees. They wrote letters to an agricultural station in Santa Fe that had been established 3 years earlier, asking about the best rootstock for high desert conditions and the most recent methods for controlling the blight. A letter came back 3 weeks later from a man named Dr. August Green, who was apparently quite senior at the station, and who was clearly delighted to receive an inquiry that demonstrated practical field experience. He corresponded directly with Jennie, having apparently noticed from the letter that she was the one who knew the orchard, and she corresponded back, and over the following months this exchange became a significant resource in their planning. August watched this with open admiration. "You should have been an agricultural scientist," he said one evening, watching her draft a detailed response to Dr. Green's questions about the blight patterns she had observed. "I am an agricultural scientist," she said without looking up. "I'm simply not paid like one," he laughed. "Fair point," he said. February was when the trouble came, though trouble in the territory rarely announced itself in advance. It came in the form of a man named Russell Gant, who had ridden through Dusty Creek and heard, as men always do, the bits and pieces of local story that make up a small town circulation of information. What he had heard was that the Talbot orchard had been bought at auction by some Texas landman, and that there was a woman involved and the whole arrangement was irregular. What he saw in this, apparently, was opportunity. He came to the property on a Tuesday morning, when August had ridden to town for a week's worth of supplies. Jennie was in the North Apple block, checking the mulch around the base of several trees she was most concerned about, when she heard a horse coming up the access road and looked up to see a man she did not recognize. He was well dressed in a showy way, with a hat that cost more than it needed to, and a manner that communicated he was accustomed to being looked at. He rode up to the fence and stopped without dismounting, which Jennie recognized as the posture of a man who wanted to establish a particular relationship of height before the conversation began. She did not adjust her posture to accommodate this. "Miss Talbot," he said. "Yes," she said. "Russell Gant," he said. "I'm a land investor. I wanted to come out and take a look at this property. I understand it was bought at auction recently." He looked around at the orchard with the expression of a man who has already decided what he is going to say about something. Quite a situation you've got here. A lot of dead wood. There's a lot of healthy wood too, she said. What can I do for you, Mr. Gant? I've been speaking to people in town, he said, and I understand the arrangement you have here with the man who bought the property might be somewhat informal. Handshake deals and so on. I wanted to make you aware that I would be interested in purchasing this land at a fair price, and that whatever informal understanding you might have could be a difficult thing to enforce if the deed is recorded at the land office, she said pleasantly. In both names, August Townsend and Jennie Talbot. I can give you the date of recording if you'd like to verify it yourself. Mr. Blevins has the paperwork. He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, a recalibration. I see, he said. Yes, she said. Is there anything else? He studied her for another moment with the look of a man deciding whether to change his angle of approach. She met his gaze steadily and waited. I'll be honest with you, Miss Talbot, he said, shifting in the saddle. This land has potential, but it needs real investment, the kind that the investment is already underway, she said. We've treated 60% of the affected trees this winter, replanned the irrigation for the spring season, and have established correspondence with the agricultural station in Santa Fe regarding the blight management. The orchard will have a productive season this year. She paused. Thank you for your interest. The land is not for sale. He looked at her for another moment, then tipped his hat in a way that conveyed acknowledgement if not particularly good grace, and turned his horse and rode back down the access road. Jennie watched him go. She stood in the January cold among the bare apple trees and watched him go, and she felt the solid fact of her name on that deed like something physical, like the bark of the oldest tree under her hand. When August came back that afternoon, she told him about it directly, because she was not a woman who managed information to protect people's feelings when they deserved the truth. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Did he threaten you? He asked. Not openly, she said. He implied things. He would not have been the first man to try to leverage an informal arrangement, but there's nothing informal about ours. No, August said. There isn't. He paused. Are you all right? She looked at him. Yes, she said. I handled it. I know you did, he said. I'm not asking because I doubt your ability to handle it. I'm asking because it's an unpleasant thing to have someone come to your property and imply they could take it from you. She softened slightly. I'm all right, she said, but I'd like to write to the land office and get a certified copy of the deed. For our records. I'll ride back tomorrow, he said. We'll both ride, she said. I want to handle it myself. He looked at her with that expression she had come to know well now, the slight, warm recognition that was as close to a smile as he often came when the moment called for steadiness rather than warmth. All right, he said. They rode to town the next morning and collected the certified copy and rode back. And when she folded it and put it in the tin box where she kept important papers, she felt something settle in her that had been slightly unsettled since Tuesday. March came in with high wind and a last stubborn cold snap that threatened several of the younger trees, and they spent 3 days working around the clock in shifts. First Jennie, then August, wrapping the most vulnerable trunks and checking the mulch, and doing what could be done against a cold that was simply determined to make things difficult. On the third night, when the temperature finally relented and the wind died and they could reasonably say the crisis had passed, they were both in the kitchen, exhausted, sitting on opposite sides of the table with their hands wrapped around their coffee cups. I think we got all of them, August said. His voice was rough with tiredness. The young Macintosh in the east row looked questionable this morning, she said. I'll check it at first light. We'll check it at first light, she said. He looked at her and smiled, the full smile again, the one she had become very fond of and which she had noticed he gave specifically to her and not to the world in general. Yes, he said. We will. She looked at him across the table. The lamp was burning low and the kitchen was warm with the residual heat of the stove. And outside the wind had finally stopped, and it was the particular deep silence of a cold night when a crisis has passed. She was bone-tired and her hair had come loose from its pin hours ago, and she was wearing a coat over her night clothes because she had gotten up in the night to check the trees, and she had not in that particular moment any energy left for caution or propriety or the management of feelings. "August," she said. He waited. "I think I love you," she said. "I'm not certain yet because I've been careful about being certain, but I think that's what this is." He was very still for a moment. The lamp light moved across his face and she could see him take it in, the way he took in everything carefully, fully, with his whole attention. "Jennie," he said, and his voice was quiet. "I have known since November." "November," she said. "That's the day it snowed," he said. "You were standing at the edge of the south orchard looking up at the trees, and you looked at them the way you look at something you love without reservation. And I thought, yes, I know what this is." She held his gaze across the table. "You've been patient," she said. "I would have been patient for longer," he said. "I would have been patient indefinitely if you'd needed it." She stood up and walked around the table to where he sat, and he stood up too, and she took his face in both her hands and looked at him for a moment. This man who had arrived to claim a ruined orchard and had instead, somehow, become the truest thing in her life, and she kissed him. It was not a tentative kiss. She was not, when she finally decided on something, a tentative person. He kissed her back with the same directness, his hands coming to her waist, and they stood in the warm kitchen in the March night with the crisis past, and the trees saved, and nothing between them any more except the truth. They became formally engaged on April 7th, 1883, on a morning that was warm enough to sit on the front porch, which they did, with coffee, and August produced a ring that had been his mother's, a simple band with a small turquoise stone that had been fashioned by a Navajo silversmith. His mother had bought it from years ago. He had written to her in March, and she had sent it south with a letter that said, among other things, "I believe from your description that this woman is far more sensible than you are, and that is an excellent quality in a partner. I expect to meet her by summer." Jennie held the ring and looked at it for a long moment. The turquoise was the color of the sky over the high country in early morning. "It's beautiful," she said. "She'll like you," August said. "She's not easy to impress, but she'll like you." "I'm not easy to impress either," Jennie said. "No," he said, "but she is impressed by the same things you are, work and honesty and knowing what you know without exaggerating it." She put the ring on. It fit as if it had been made for her finger, which she took as a good sign, being practical enough about life to accept good omens where they presented themselves. They were married on June 14th, 1883, in Dusty Creek, in the small Methodist church that had been built 4 years earlier, and that served the surrounding community as the only religious gathering space within 20 miles. The minister was a young man named Reverend Cole, who had only been in Dusty Creek 8 months, and who approached the ceremony with enormous seriousness, and a copy of the prayer book he consulted rather more frequently than his authority warranted, but who managed nonetheless to conduct a service that was sincere and simple and exactly right. August's mother came from Texas. Her name was Clara Townsend, a compact, sharp-eyed woman in her late 50s who arrived on the stage from Las Cruces with one carpet bag, and an expression that conveyed she was prepared to assess everything and be satisfied by nothing. She and Jennie met in the parlor of the town's small boarding house the evening before the wedding, and Clara looked at her son's fiancé for a long moment and then said, "He wrote me you saved those trees through 2 droughts by yourself." "Is that accurate?" "3 droughts technically," Jennie said, "though the third was minor." Clara nodded. "Good," she said. "He needs someone who doesn't exaggerate. He has a tendency to see things as slightly better than they are, which is useful in a land buyer and trying in a husband." Jennie smiled. "I'll keep that in mind." Clara smiled back, a real smile, the full version, and Jennie recognized it immediately as the source of August's. The ceremony was attended by most of Dusty Creek, because small towns in the territory attended any significant event with full community participation, and also because Jennie was known and liked by most of the people there, who had watched her manage the orchard situation with a combination of admiration and the general human pleasure of seeing something work out that could have gone badly. Harlan Prout brought a cake from the general store's kitchen, a remarkable gesture, since Harlan's relationship to generosity was normally conducted through profit. Mrs. Sims, the doctor's wife, brought preserved summer peaches in a jar tied with a ribbon, which she presented to Jennie with the particular warmth of a woman who had watched another woman struggle and was relieved to see her on the other side of it. August stood at the front of the church and watched Jennie walk toward him, and she watched him watching her, and neither of them looked away. And when Reverend Cole asked the words the law required, they answered them directly, without hesitation, with the straightforward commitment of two people who had thought about what they were agreeing to and meant it fully. The reception was held outside, because June in New Mexico territory was warm and clear, and the church did not have a hall, and someone brought a fiddle and someone else brought a guitar, and the evening stretched out longer than planned because people were enjoying themselves. August danced with Jennie twice. He was not a skilled dancer, a fact he admitted freely, but he was earnest about it, and she laughed the whole time, which he had decided was a sufficient outcome. Clara Townsend stayed for 2 weeks after the wedding, sleeping in the house's upper room, which Jennie had cleared and made comfortable. She spent most of her time in the orchard, asking detailed questions about the trees and the management and the plans for the coming years, and by the end of the second week, she had developed strong opinions about 2 of Jennie's grafting decisions, one of which she was right about, and one of which Jennie politely argued down with evidence from the agricultural station correspondence, at which point Clara said, "All right, you have your reasons," with the expression of a woman who is used to winning arguments and finds the loss not unpleasant when the counterargument is good. She went back to Texas with a jar of preserved peaches and a letter from Jennie to the agricultural station contact that she had agreed to deliver to the postal station in Las Cruces. At the stage door, she took Jennie's hands in both of hers and said, "You are precisely what I hoped," and got into the stage before Jennie could form a response. August came to stand beside her as they watched the stage pull away. "She likes you," he said. "I know," Jennie said. "I like her too." He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him slightly, and they stood in the June morning light watching the stage until it was out of sight. The summer of 1883 was the summer the orchard began to turn around in a way that was visible and real, and not merely hopeful. The peaches in the South Block came in heavy and sweet, not a record crop by any measure, but a genuinely good one, enough that Jennie contracted to sell 3/4 of it to Harlan's and to a grocer in Mesilla who had heard about the quality and sent a letter of inquiry. The apple block was recovering more slowly, as apple trees always do, but the lime treatment had clearly had an effect on the affected trees, and the new growth coming in on the treated specimens was clean and strong. Dr. Green from the agricultural station came in person in August, which Jennie had not expected. He had written to say he would like to see the results of the blight treatment in situ, and she had written back to welcome him, and he appeared one Tuesday afternoon in a buggy driven by a station assistant, a small energetic man of perhaps 60 with an enormous white mustache, and the look of someone who has spent 40 years being enthusiastic about plants and intends to continue indefinitely. He walked the orchard with Jennie for 3 hours, his notebook out, asking questions and taking samples, and occasionally crouching to look at the root systems of trees she had flagged for him. August walked with them, asking his own questions, and Dr. Green addressed himself to both of them with equal seriousness, which Jennie noted and appreciated. At the end of the afternoon, Dr. Green stood at the edge of the South Peach block with his notebook in hand and said, "Miss Talbot, Mrs. Townsend, I beg your pardon. What you have accomplished here in the past 8 months is genuinely remarkable. The blight management protocol you developed is, in several respects, ahead of what we are doing at the station. I would like your permission to write it up for the station's publication, with full attribution." Jennie looked at him. Looked at August, who was looking at her with an expression of open delight. She looked back at Dr. Green. "Yes," she said, "you have my permission." "I will need your notes," he said, "all of them in as much detail as you have." "I have complete records going back to 1877, she said, "the full documentation of the blight outbreak that year and everything I have done since." Dr. Green's mustache appeared to quiver with excitement. "Excellent," he said. August caught her eye over Dr. Green's head and gave her the full smile, and she looked away before she smiled back, because she was in the middle of a serious professional conversation, and she was not yet sure she could maintain her composure if she looked at him when he looked at her like that. The publication came out the following spring, 1884, in the New Mexico Agricultural Station's Quarterly Report. Field Methods for the Management of Apple Scab and Related Blight Conditions in High Desert Orchard Settings, with documented outcomes from the Talbot Townsend Orchard, Dusty Creek, New Mexico Territory. Jennie's name was first on the publication. She received her copies of the Gazette in a paper parcel from Santa Fe and opened it sitting at the kitchen table and read her own name in print with an expression that August, watching from across the room, recognized as the composed exterior she placed over deep emotion. He said nothing. He let her have the moment. Then she looked up at him and held the page out, and he took it and read it, and he looked at her name in print and then at her face, and he said simply, "Yes," as if she had asked him something which she had not, but which he had answered anyway, because the answer was the same for every question she might have asked. By the fall of 1884, Jennie was expecting their first child. She worked in the orchard until the end of October, when August began very diplomatically suggesting that certain tasks be delegated to the 2 hired hands they had taken on for the harvest season, young men from the town, brothers named Pete and Del Vargas, who were good workers and who had been coming back for 2 seasons now, and knew the orchard's rhythms nearly as well as anyone who had not grown up in it. Jennie accepted the delegation without as much argument as August had braced for, which told him something about how she was feeling, since Jennie's willingness to accept help was in direct proportion to how certain she was of the necessity. She spent more time in the evenings with the ledger and the correspondence, planning the next year's planting schedule, and conducting an increasingly engaged exchange with Dr. Green, who had by now come to treat her as a genuine colleague, and had introduced her correspondence to 2 other agricultural researchers who were working on related questions in Arizona Territory and California. She told August once, on a winter evening when they were sitting by the stove, and she was reading a letter from the California researcher with her feet up on the footstool he had fashioned from an apple wood log, "I think I could have had a very different kind of life if things had been different." "What kind?" he asked. "A researcher," she said. "A scientist, properly speaking, if there had been a way to do that for someone like me." She said it without bitterness. She had examined the injustice of it long enough that she could name it plainly. The world did not provide for women what it provided for men in terms of education and professional opportunity, and this was simply a fact she had lived with and around for her entire life. But it sat in her with the particular weight of things that are not fair. "You are a scientist," August said quietly. "The station publishes your work. You're in correspondence with 3 of the leading researchers in the field. The fact that there's no degree attached to your name doesn't make the knowledge less real." She looked at him over the letter. "You always say the right thing," she said. "It's occasionally irritating." "I know," he said. "I can try to be worse at it." She laughed and went back to the letter. Their son was born on March 3, 1885, a cold, clear Monday morning with the help of Mrs. Sims, who served as midwife and who was calm and competent, and who informed August, when he attempted to hover near the bedroom door, that she had been doing this for 20 years, and he was not the first anxious husband she had encountered, and he could either find something useful to do or she would find something for him. He went and checked the orchard. When Mrs. Sims came to the stable to tell him the news, he was standing in the north apple block in the cold morning light, touching the bark of the oldest tree without quite knowing why, and she said, "You have a boy, Mr. Townsend. Both of them are well." He went inside then quickly, and up to the room where Jennie was sitting up in bed, more composed than any woman had a right to be after the morning she had just had, with a small bundled person in her arms who was, in August's admittedly biased assessment, the most remarkable thing he had ever seen. "He's healthy," Jennie said. Mrs. Sims confirmed it. "Good weight, good lungs." She looked down at the baby with an expression August had never quite seen on her face before, an openness, a warmth, something past her usual reserve, vast and simple. "He is," August said, sitting on the edge of the bed. He touched the back of his finger to the baby's cheek, the softness of it incomprehensible. "Do we call him?" "I was thinking Cornelius," she said. "For my father, but not as a first name. It's a heavy name for a small person, as a middle name." "Cornelius," August said, "and the first." "I thought you might have a preference," she said, which was unusual enough, her inviting him to lead the decision, that he understood how much she meant it as a gift. He thought for a moment. "James," he said. "My grandfather, he was a good man." "James Cornelius Townsend," she said, trying it. "James Cornelius Townsend," he confirmed. The baby opened his eyes for a moment, the unfocused, philosophical gaze of the very new, and then closed them again. "He looks like you," Jennie said. "He looks like a baby," August said. "He looks like you," she repeated, and August did not argue, and if he was right and she was also right, that was simply because some things can be both. The years that followed were full ones. Not easy, the territory did not deal in easy, the land was too large and too honest for that, but full in the way that lives are full when they are being genuinely lived. The orchard recovered completely by 1886, which was the year the East Section produced its first proper apple harvest since the blight, and which Jennie marked in the ledger with an asterisk and a date. As she marked all significant events, the understated historian of a piece of land that would have gone to ruin without her. They hired Pete and Del Vargas on a permanent basis, and paid them fairly, which was not universally the practice in the territory, and which Jennie insisted on from the beginning, partly because she knew what it was to do essential work that was undervalued, and had no interest in perpetuating that in her own operation. The Vargas brothers were industrious and loyal, and knew the orchard well, and they became, over the years, as much a part of the orchard's daily life as Jennie and August themselves. August continued to deal in land on a limited basis, because he had a talent for it, and it provided additional income in the seasons when the orchard was working through its cycles, but he operated within a single day's ride of Dusty Creek, and he was home for supper most nights and always on weekends, because those were the non-negotiable terms of his own life as he had designed it. They had a second child in 1887, a daughter they named Clara Rose Clara for August's mother, who upon hearing this via letter sent back a response that was formally gracious and clearly delighted, and Rose because Jennie had always loved that name without a particular reason, and the name they give for love alone is sometimes the most honest. Clara Rose arrived in July, the hottest month, and she arrived fast and decisively, which Mrs. Sims declared to be entirely in keeping with what she knew of her parents, and which Jennie considered a fair assessment. James Cornelius, who was 2 at the time and known universally as Jimmy, received his sister with the focused suspicion of a child who has been told he will love something and is not yet convinced. By the time Clara was 3 months old, he had reversed his position completely and could frequently be found sitting next to her blanket with a proprietary air, showing her things with great seriousness. A smooth stone, a piece of apple wood, a drawing he had made with coal. Clara Rose, when she began to talk, called him Jim, which no one else called him, And the name stuck between them the way things stick that are chosen by the right person at the right moment. Jennie's publication record continued to grow through these years, which was not a thing that happened to most women in the territory in the 1880s, and which generated a particular kind of attention, mostly positive, occasionally skeptical, always curious. Dr. Green remained her primary correspondent and advocate, and through him, she was invited in 1888 to present at a gathering of agricultural researchers in Santa Fe, a 3-day event that was the first time she had been anywhere that might be called a professional conference, and the first time she had spoken about her methods to a room full of people. She prepared for it with the same thoroughness she brought to the orchard, completely, methodically, leaving nothing to chance. August rode with her to Santa Fe, which took 2 days by wagon, and he sat in the second row of the gathered researchers while she stood at the front of the room and spoke about the blight management protocol she had developed over 12 years of field work in the Dusty Creek orchard, and he watched the room listen to her, and he thought that this was the thing he had known since November of 1882, since the snowy morning when she stood at the edge of the South Orchard. She was remarkable. And remarkable was not an overstatement, and the world was gradually, imperfectly, coming around to knowing it too. She spoke for 40 minutes without notes. She answered questions for another 20. At the end, Dr. Green introduced her to a man named Professor Whitfield from an agricultural college in New Mexico Territory that had just been established the previous year, and Professor Whitfield said, with the directness of someone who has reached an age where indirection seems like waste, "Mrs. Townsend, I want to talk to you about an honorary lectureship. We have students who need to learn what you know." She looked at him for a moment. She looked at August, who was standing beside her. August said nothing. He never did in these moments because he understood that his role was not to answer for her. She looked back at Professor Whitfield. "I'd like to hear more," she said. "Tell me what it would involve." The lectureship meant she traveled to Las Cruces, where the college was, 3 times a year to spend a week teaching. It meant being away from the orchard for those weeks, which required planning and trust in Pete and Dell, who were more than capable. It meant staying in a room at the college's guest house, and eating in the dining hall, and conducting herself in an academic environment, which was entirely new to her, and which she approached with the same combination of thorough preparation and fundamental confidence she brought to everything. The first trip was in the spring of 1889, and when she came back at the end of the week, August met her at the road where it curved toward the orchard entrance, having seen the wagon coming from the ridge. He helped her down, and she stood in the late afternoon light of her own land, smelling the apple trees and the red clay soil and the particular air that was the air of this place, and she put her hands on his face and kissed him the way she had kissed him first in the kitchen on the March night when the crisis had passed. "How was it?" he said. "They are good students," she said. "There were 2 in particular who understand the field work. One of them came from a farm background in Arizona, and she has excellent instincts." He said. "Yes," Jennie said. "There are women in the program. It's a newer institution, and it was established with the explicit intention of educating both." She paused. "I think my father would have liked knowing that." He looked at her face, the warmth and the satisfaction in it, and the quiet, persistent grief that lived alongside the warmth in the way it always does in people who have loved and lost. "Yes," he said, "I think he would have." They walked up the road to the house together, and Jimmy came running from the direction of the stable where he had been following Del Vargas around with the dedicated interest of a 4-year-old, who has decided that Del Vargas is the most interesting person in the world. And Jennie caught him and swung him up, and he told her at rapid length about everything she had missed, the particulars of which involved a cat, a fence post, and some kind of event involving the water trough that Del Vargas had apparently adjudicated. Clara Rose was sitting on the porch steps watching her brother's greeting with the mild patience of a 1-year-old, who has not yet developed the mobility to participate, but is clearly taking notes. Jennie sat down on the porch steps and settled Clara in her lap, and Jimmy came and leaned against her, and they sat there in the late afternoon, all of them, looking out at the orchard in the spring light, the trees in full blossom, white and pink against the red clay hills, the whole place alive with the particular urgency of April, everything growing, everything turning toward the light. August sat beside Jennie on the steps, and she leaned her shoulder against his, and he did not say anything, because there was nothing that needed saying, because this was it. This was the whole of what he had been looking for in the years of moving without knowing what he was moving toward, and it was here on this slope above Dusty Creek in the territory of New Mexico, in the spring of 1889, with the orchard in bloom and his family around him, and the woman he loved beside him. By 1891, the Talbot Townsend orchard, as it was now listed in Harlan's supply accounts, and in the Santa Fe correspondence, and in the agricultural station publications, both names always, as Jennie had insisted from the beginning, was producing 3 varieties of apple and 2 of peach at a volume that made it one of the more successful small operations in the region. The root rot had been fully eradicated in the oldest sections. 3 of the trees her grandfather had planted before the war were still standing, still producing, their massive gnarled trunks wrapped in their autumn copper, and their spring white as reliably as the seasons themselves. Jimmy was 6 and had started at the small school in Dusty Creek, where he was apparently a serious and attentive student, and also, according to his teacher Miss Porter, the child most likely to interrupt a lesson with an accurate and detailed observation about plant biology, which Jimmy did not understand as an unusual thing to know about, and which his parents had no intention of discouraging. Clara Rose was 4 and already demonstrating the particular decisive quality that her mother associated with good judgment, and her father associated with stubbornness, and which were, in both cases, entirely accurate. She had recently informed Del Vargas that the East Row peach trees were not being pruned correctly, and had supported this claim with an argument that Del had brought to Jennie in a state of mild bewilderment, and Jennie had looked at Clara's reasoning and said, "She's right. The cut angle is too steep on those 3, and Del had looked at Clara with the expression of a man revising his assessment of a situation. One October evening in 1891, 9 years almost exactly since the morning August had ridden up the access road, and found Jennie in the branches of a peach tree with her skirts tucked and her boots bark dusted, they sat together on the front porch after the children were in bed. The autumn air was clear and cool, and the moon was coming up over the eastern hills, and the orchard was silver in the moonlight, the way it always was on clear nights in October, the branches making their complicated shadow patterns on the pale ground. "Do you remember the first day?" August said. "I do," she said. "What did you think when you saw me?" She considered honestly. "I thought you did not look like a banker," she said, "which I meant as a point in your favor, and you took your hat off." "It seemed appropriate," he said. "You were in a tree." "I was working," she said. "There's a difference." "You're always working," he said, but warmly, without complaint, as observation. "So are you," she said. He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the arm of her chair. She turned her hand over and held his. "I looked at those trees," he said, "the first day, and I thought someone has cared for these very much. I could see it in the way they were tended. I didn't know who had done it yet, but I knew someone had." She was quiet for a moment. "It was the only thing I had left," she said, "after my father, and I had already been losing it, but I couldn't leave. I couldn't let them go." "I know," he said, "and you were right not to." She looked out at the orchard in the moonlight. She thought about the morning the auction notice had been on the post outside Harlan's, the tight grief in her chest, the lye soap and the muslin she had bought, and the long walk home. She thought about standing with her hand against the oldest tree, feeling the solid, indifferent fact of it against her palm. She thought about standing in the snowy south orchard and saying it's beautiful without knowing yet how much that moment was. She thought about the graft her father had described, the best of one thing joined to something struggling, growing together into what neither could manage alone. "August," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'm glad you bid," she said. "I'm glad you were the only one." He squeezed her hand. "There was never any question," he said. "I looked at those trees and I knew." She leaned back in her chair and looked at the sky, the sweep of the stars over the mesa, the enormous western dark between them and the high country. An owl called from somewhere in the apple block and was answered from further away. The October air moved through the orchard and the branches shifted, a long silver shiver in the moonlight. In 1893, the territory was talking about statehood, which would not come for another 18 years, but was beginning to feel possible in the way that things feel possible when enough people start taking them seriously. The railroad had come through more of the region, changing the distances between places, opening markets that had previously required significant effort to reach. Jennie had sold this growing season's peach harvest not just to Harlan's and the Mesilla grocer, but to a wholesaler in Albuquerque who distributed to hotels throughout the territory, and the orchard's income for the year was the best it had ever been. She was 35 years old and had been tending this land for 21 of them. August was 41 and had been here for 11, and had become, over that time, as much a part of the orchard as she was slower in the specific knowledge, still but present in everything, his hands in the soil, his judgment in the decisions, his capital transformed long since into shared life. Jimmy, at 8, was learning to graft under Jennie's direction, his small, serious face bent over the cut junction with the focused attention he brought to everything his mother taught him. Clara Rose, at 6, had recently claimed one small peach tree as her particular responsibility, which Pete Vargas had helped her choose from the younger section, and she tended it with a ferocity that was entirely her own. There was also, since the previous February, a third child, another boy, born on the coldest night of the year, in a timing that Jennie had regarded with equanimity and Mrs. Sims with mild professional exasperation. They named him Thomas William Thomas for no particular person, but because it seemed right, and William for August's older brother back in Texas, who had written a warm letter of congratulation and sent a carved wooden horse for Jimmy that had been sitting on the mantelpiece for 3 years. Thomas was a mild baby, in contrast to his siblings, who had both been quite definitive about their opinions from the beginning. He regarded the world with a large-eyed calm that Jennie recognized, after a few months, as a form of deep attention rather than passivity. He was watching everything, cataloging, understanding at his own pace in his own way. August held Thomas one evening on the porch, the baby drowsing against his chest, and Jennie came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside him and looked at her husband with the complete, unhurried attention of a person who has chosen well and knows it. "Happy," she said. He looked at her over the sleeping baby's head. "There is not a word for what I am," he said. "Happy is the outside of it." She handed him his coffee and he took it one-handed, the other arm keeping Thomas, and she put her feet up on the porch rail and they sat in the summer evening, while Jimmy's voice carried from somewhere in the orchard, where he was doing something with Dell that involved considerable discussion, and Clara Rose was inside reading with the focused appetite she had developed for books in the last year since she had discovered that the school library in Dusty Creek could also order books from Santa Fe on request. The orchard moved through its seasons. The trees grew older and the new plantings grew taller, and there were always things to do, and things to decide and things to learn. And Jennie continued teaching at Las Cruces 3 times a year in August, continued his occasional land work. And Pete and Dell Vargas married in consecutive years, Pete to a woman from Mesilla named Rosa who came to the orchard and was welcomed, and Dell to a girl from Dusty Creek named Agnes who brought her own fierce practicality to everything she touched and who Jennie liked immediately. The publication that had started with Dr. Green's field report in 1884 had grown, by 1895, into something considerable. 5 papers in regional agricultural journals, a chapter in a collected volume on desert farming practices published in 1892 by a university press in the East, and a course at the Las Cruces College that had been taken by, at last count, 67 students, a number of whom had written Jennie afterward to tell her what they had done with what she taught them. She kept these letters in a separate box from the official correspondence. On certain evenings she read one, not out of vanity but out of something more like refueling. She needed to know that the knowledge was traveling outward, that the years of work were compounding in the way the best things compound, going beyond what any one person could do alone. One letter, received in 1894, was from the young woman from Arizona that Jennie had noticed in her first Las Cruces class, the one with excellent instincts. Her name was Marta Delgado, and she had gone back to her family's farm in Arizona Territory and implemented a version of the blight treatment protocol, and written to say that it had saved their orchard through a difficult season. She asked several detailed questions about a specific variety of apple she was working with, and Jennie wrote back 2 pages of specific answer, and thus began a correspondence that continued for many years. The oldest apple tree, the one her grandfather had planted, the one she had pressed her hand against in the worst hour of her grief, the one that had survived the blight and the drought and the root rot and the cold snap of 1883 and the flooding of 1886 and 37 years of New Mexico, whether bore fruit in the fall of 1895, that Jennie considered the finest apple she had ever tasted. She ate one standing in the north block, Jimmy beside her, Clara, Rose, and Thomas somewhere ahead in the row, the October light golden and particular. She took a second apple and gave it to Jimmy, and he bit into it with the deliberate, focused attention he gave to things he knew were significant, and chewed slowly and said, "It's sweet." "Very," she said. "Is this the old grandfather tree?" "Yes," she said. He looked up at the tree with the expression she recognized as his, the one that was very like his father's, patient and interested, taking the whole thing in. "You've been taking care of it my whole life," he said. "And before that," she said. "And you'll take care of it for a long time more," he said. Not anxiously, he was 8 and the question was simple, not fearful. "Yes," she said. "And eventually you will, and Clara and Thomas if they choose to. And if not them, then whoever comes after." She paused. "The tree will outlive all of us if we're lucky. That's the point of a tree." He nodded slowly, in the way that children nod when they understand something larger than the words contain. Then he ran off toward Clara's voice in the next row, and Jennie stood alone a moment with the apple in her hand and the ancient tree above her, and the whole orchard around her, alive and breathing in the October air. That evening she told August what Jimmy had said, and he listened with the attention he always gave her, and then he said, "He's going to be all right, that boy." "Yes," she said, "all 3 of them are going to be all right." "Because of you," he said. "Because of us," she corrected, in the tone she had used from the beginning, the tone that did not allow the accounting to be skewed in either direction, that demanded the full truth of how things were. He smiled the full smile. "Because of us," he agreed. They were, as it turned out, going to have one more. The 4th came in 1897, a girl they named Harriet June, and she came into the world in the spring in the same house where Jennie had been born, in the same room, and Jennie held her in the early morning light, and felt the particular fullness of a life that had come through grief and fear and uncertainty, and arrived here, in this room, with this person in her arms and the orchard outside the window just beginning to show its spring blossom. August came in when Mrs. Sims let him and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Harriet June with the same expression he had worn when he looked at James Cornelius, 15 years before, unguarded and overwhelmed and profoundly moved. He took Jennie's free hand without saying anything. "4," she said after a moment. "4," he agreed. "That's probably enough," she said. "That is absolutely enough," he said, and they looked at each other and laughed, the genuine, easy laugh of people who have known each other long enough that laughter is the natural language for the largest things. Jimmy was 13 by then and had become, in the orchard, something more than his mother's student. He was a partner in the daily work, capable and increasingly knowledgeable, with a particular gift for the mechanical aspects of irrigation that no one in the family had previously excelled at, and which had become relevant as they expanded the East Block. Clara was 11 and had been helping Jennie with the Las Cruces course preparation for 2 years, organizing the samples and the notes with a precision that Jennie found both useful and occasionally alarming. Thomas was 4 and had recently declared an interest in horses that was entirely distinct from any interest in orchards, which Jennie accepted with the equanimity of a woman who understands that children are not small versions of their parents but separate people with their own directions. Harriet June, as she grew, turned out to be the most purely sociable of the 4, the child who made friends instantly, who knew everyone in Dusty Creek by name and history, who brought home other children the way a warm kitchen draws cold people. She had August's dark hair and Jennie's steady gray eyes and some quality entirely her own that was approximately best described as natural warmth, the ability to make a person feel genuinely known. The orchard continued. The orchard always continued, season by season, year by year, the trees growing in their slow, patient way, the blossom and the fruit and the bare winter branches and the spring green and the blossom again, the same as it had always been and knew each time. Jennie tracked it all in the ledger, the same careful record her father had begun, and which she had continued without interruption since his death, the history of a place in numbers and notes, and the occasional pressed leaf or dried petal tucked between the pages. In 1901, Jennie and August Townsend sat on the front porch of the house in the late afternoon of an October day, the light falling gold across the orchard, the apple harvest done and the last of the peaches put up, the year turning toward its rest. They were 43 and 51, respectively, and they had been in this place together for 19 years. Jimmy was 16 and doing much of the daily orchard management with Pete's guidance. Clara was 14 and had just received a letter from Professor Whitfield's successor at the Las Cruces College, a woman named Professor Carter, who was apparently aware of Clara's work assisting her mother, and who had written to say that the college had begun admitting women to the regular degree program, and that she hoped Clara would consider applying in 4 years' time. Clara had read this letter 3 times and was now, as far as Jennie could tell, conducting her entire daily life in light of it. Thomas was 12 and had developed a genuine aptitude for horses that August had quietly decided to cultivate by speaking to a horse trainer he knew near Las Cruces. Harriet June was 4 and had recently taken over the small chair in the corner of the kitchen as her personal domain, and was conducting from it a social operation of considerable energy. The porch was quiet. The children were variously occupied. The evening was coming in warm-edged from the west. "I want to tell you something," Jennie said. August looked at her. She looked at the orchard, then she looked at him. "I was so frightened that morning," she said, "the morning you rode up. I had been holding on for so long and the auction had happened and I didn't know what was going to come over that road. I heard your horse and I told myself to keep working because that was the only thing I could think to do, but I was frightened." He listened without looking away. "And you took your hat off," she said. "That was the first thing, and you looked at the trees the right way, and I thought, all right, this might be all right." "Might be," he said. "I was careful," she said. "I had learned to be careful." "You were right to be," he said. She held his gaze. Her face was the face of a woman of 43 who had worked outdoors her whole life, marked by sun and weather and time, and it was the finest face he had ever known, the one he had been reading for 19 years like the language of a country he had chosen as his own. "It was more than all right," she said. "Yes," he said. "It was." She reached over and took his hand. The last of the afternoon light moved through the orchard and the oldest apple tree stood in the northwest corner, its great branches spread against the sky, and the silver grass moved in the cooling air, and the smell of the earth came up from the ground the way it always did in October, rich and particular and irreducible. The smell of this place, their place, the place where the ruined orchard had been saved, and the two people who saved it had, in the saving, been made whole. A meadowlark called from the fence line, a clear rising thread of sound, and was answered from further along the row, and the evening settled around them the way evenings do on land that has been loved for a long time, gently, fully, without reservation. August lifted her hand and pressed his mouth to her fingers, a brief, deliberate gesture, and she turned her hand to hold his, and they sat like that as the light faded from gold to copper to the pale rose of the desert evening, and the orchard breathed around them, and the whole 43 acres were alive with the quiet certainty of things that have weathered what they had to weather and come through to the other side intact. Inside the house, Harriet June was singing something to herself in her corner of the kitchen, a small tuneless melody of her own composition, and Clara's voice came from upstairs reading something aloud, practicing the recitation she had been working on for 2 weeks. Thomas's boots sounded on the back porch where he had come in from the stable. Jimmy's silhouette appeared briefly in the doorway of the barn across the yard, checking the latch, then disappeared inside. It was an ordinary evening on a working farm in the New Mexico Territory in the autumn of 1901, and it was, for the two people sitting on the front porch in the last of the light with their hands in each other's hands, exactly everything they had ever needed the world to be. The orchard would outlive them. That was the nature of orchards. The oldest tree was already 37 years older than Jennie, planted by her grandfather in a territory that had not yet been organized, before the war that changed everything, and the peace that reorganized what remained. It would stand long after she was gone, as it had stood before she arrived, putting out its blossom in April and its fruit in September, surviving what needed to be survived, simply continuing in the way of things that have learned the deepest discipline of all, the discipline of endurance, of patience, of trusting that the next season will come. But that was later. That was the future, which always arrives in its own time and does not require anticipation to be real. Right now there was the porch and the evening and the orchard and the children and the 20 years of accumulated truth that lay between two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances. A ruined orchard at auction, a bid no one else made, a woman coming down from a tree and a man with his hat in his hand, and who had built from that beginning something that warranted no other word but love. Complete, present, and more than enough.